part of the challenge we face as a country is that
entrepreneurs, investors, and government officials all flood the 23rd edition of the National Economic Summit Group in the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja. The gathering this time considers the theme Opportunities, Productivity and Employment, actualizing the economic recovery and growth plan.
And that was what the Vice President said.
This comes as Nigeria exits recession after a year of economic crunch. Agriculture and manufacturing are said to be the two key sectors that rescued Nigeria's economy from recession in the second quarter of 2017. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, Nigeria exited recession with a positive growth of 0.55%. The thematic pillars for discussion here include Think Nigeria, skills, competencies and capacity, access to capital, legislations and economic inclusion.
When we held the last edition of the summit, Nigeria was grappling with the worst economic slowdown and first recession in 25 years. But the government and business community can now heave a measured sigh of relief as the latest GDP growth numbers confirmed that Nigeria has slipped out of recession, albeit with a very modest 0.55% growth in the second quarter of this year. The recovery was led by the oil sector, which was driven by higher oil prices and improved production. At the last summit, the NESG called for a more pragmatic engagement of the Niger Delta region by the federal government to address the frequent disruption to oil production linked to vandalism of oil production and transportation infrastructure. We are pleased to note that the impact of the engagement of the government and the resultant impact on the broader economy. However, growth in the non-oil economy remained low. It's growing, but low. Nevertheless, we note that action led by the Central Bank of Nigeria to stabilize the exchange rate and increase dollar supply to the economy also meant that many industries in the non-oil sector were able to turn the corner after a very difficult 2016.
And the private sector owns 51%.
This year's summit objectives include outlining national job deficits, defining a reviewed national framework for new economic opportunities, set out a reviewed framework for entrepreneurship and innovation, among others.
We have now had several sessions of the Presidential Quarterly Business Forum, which enables an exchange of views between the federal government and the organized private sector. The last meeting, we had a very useful interaction between the private sector and heads of the regulatory agencies on how to improve the business environment. This leads me to the 8th point, which was raised last year, our efforts to improve the business environment. With the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, PEBEC, we introduced reforms under a 60-day national action plan focused on 8 areas that make it easier to register, that make it easier to do business. This includes registration of business, obtaining construction permits, and we've had to work with certain specific subnationals to achieve this. We're working with Kano, we're working with the Kano State Government, with Lagos State Government, and the Rivers State Government. Trade across borders, facilitating the entry and exit of people and registration of property. Our visa on arrival process has proved to be quite effective, and we've got several testimonies on the visa on arrival process. These are some of the examples of what we've tried to do with the ease of doing business.
Though the International Monetary Fund only sees Nigeria growing at less than 3% by 2020, the federal government has now set up an implementation committee for the ERGP, its economic blueprint to turn around Nigeria's economy and achieve an ambitious 7% economic growth by 2020. The first task is to ensure that the 2018 budget is largely in line with the ERGP by insisting that only projects supported by the ERGP will be funded in the budget. The federal government is establishing economic micro-labs at the state level in the coming weeks to increase investment by enhancing the exposure of foreign and local investors to subnational administrators on a sector-by-sector basis. This is according to the Minister for Budget and Planning.
We no longer talk as we used to in 1993. People no longer talk of the public sector having exclusive dominion of the commanding heights of the economy, from which the private sector is excluded. Instead, government now accepts that the private sector has an important and critical role to play, even in such areas as providing key infrastructure, such as roads and rail. And I'm sure you've heard of a number of initiatives in that direction, in which the private sector is being brought in to provide, and in partnership with the public sector, to provide roads and other infrastructure. And even in managing critical infrastructure, such as airports, ports, petroleum refineries, I'm sure you've also heard of the initiatives in concessioning both the Lagos as well as the Abuja airports. So it's clear that this is an administration that is committed to working with the private sector.